All right, good morning, everyone. I'd like to convene the Coastal Sharks Management Board. My name is Adam Nowalski. I'll be chairing the board this morning. To my left, I've got FMP Coordinator Ashton Harp. Our primary order of business today will be to review and consider the approval of Addendum 4 for public comment. Before we get to that point, I'd first like to welcome the couple of new faces here that we've got today. Colleen from Connecticut, Mike from New York, to the Coastal Sharks Management Board. And with that, we'll move into the agenda. Our first order of business will be to approve the agenda as presented here. Are there any changes to the agenda? Is there any objection to accepting the agenda as presented? Seeing none, the agenda is approved. Our next order of business is to approve the proceedings from the February 2016 board meeting. Is there any comments, discussion, or changes to those proceedings? Seeing none, is there any objection to accepting those proceedings? Those proceedings are hereby approved. Next order of business is for any public comment not on the agenda. There was nobody signed up. Is there anyone from the audience who would like to speak on any issues not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move on to our next order of business, which is a presentation from Ashton on Addendum 4. This addendum today is being presented as a draft that would go out for public comment with any changes discussed today. I'll turn to Ashton for a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So at the request of the board in February, the PDT developed draft Addendum 4, which I'll walk through today. So the presentation is divided into 3 parts. So first I'll go into the smooth dogfish background, and that's the species of focus for this addendum. Then I'll move into the catch composition analysis, which is the regulatory issue that we'll be discussing in this addendum. And lastly, I'll walk through the smooth dogfish management options. And as Adam mentioned, the board has the potential to approve this for public comment. It will then go to public hearings and written comment over the summer, and I would present the summary of those at the August board meeting. So smooth dogfish, a little bit about the species. It's the only species within the smoothhound complex that's found in the Atlantic, and oftentimes we use the word smoothhound and smooth dogfish interchangeably, but for the purposes of this addendum, we want to be species specific, and that's because of the Shark Conservation Act. Within the Act, there's a limited exception on the fins naturally attached policy. It allows for individuals engaged in commercial fishing for smooth dogfish to remove fins at sea, provided they meet certain requirements, which I'll discuss in the next slide. And prior to 2016, smooth dogfish were only managed in state waters. They were not part of the highly migratory species FMP prior to 2016. So this slide provides information about how smooth dogfish processing at sea is managed in state waters. So commercial fishermen can land smooth dogfish carcasses with corresponding fins removed from the carcass, provided they meet certain requirements. They must possess a valid state commercial fishing license, and the fin to carcass ratio is set at 12%. They automatically already meet 2 other requirements, which is to be fishing within 50 nautical miles of the baseline of an Atlantic state, Maine through Florida. So the 2 bullets that you see on the board were included in Addendum 2 and are consistent with the Shark Conservation Act. So now in federal waters, smooth dogfish is managed effective March 15th of 2016, and included in Amendment 9 is how they became effectively managed by the Highly Migratory Species Division. And so included in Amendment 9 is a catch composition requirement for federally permitted vessels in order to remove smooth dogfish fins at sea. So this requirement came from NOAA Fisheries' interpretation of the Shark Conservation Act phrase that says one must be fishing for smooth dogfish in order for the limited exception to apply. And they defined this kind of directed effort as a trip where smooth dogfish comprise at least 25% by weight of the total retained catch on board at the time of landing. So this brings us to the February motion. The board made a motion to initiate an addendum to address the processing at sea disconnect between federal and state waters. So there's only one issue in this addendum, and it's the catch composition requirement. So now we're moving into the body of the addendum that was presented in meeting materials. So as I mentioned, there's differing regulations in state versus federal waters now. So currently, vessels with a federal smoothhound commercial permit must comply with the 25% catch composition requirement, whereas fishermen with a state commercial fishing license are not held to any catch composition requirement. So you may be asking yourself, well, why 25%? We discussed this a little bit at the last board meeting, but I'll just briefly go into it again. Public comment during the Amendment 9 rulemaking process and landings data indicate the smooth dogfish fishery is very much a mixed fishery. There was consideration of a higher catch composition, meaning the majority of the catch on the boat would have had to have been smooth dogfish in order to process at sea, but this was ultimately not used given the multi-species nature of this fishery. Anything higher than 25% was deemed inappropriate because it would only increase regulatory discards. And that's because fishermen generally start processing smooth dogfish once it's brought on board. This is done immediately so the shark meat will not spoil. So when we started analyzing the catch composition analysis, we went to the data availability. And so the PDT had a discussion about what data was available and what could be used for this addendum. And we ultimately used the available data from the federal vessel trip reports to analyze catch composition on smooth dogfish trips. We would have liked to have used or looked at a state-by-state analysis or a coast-wide analysis, but data limitations did not allow us to do this. For example, when I first went to the PDT and we kind of wanted to see smooth dogfish landings just in the harvest from state waters versus federal waters, we could not see that. So we were roadblocked pretty quickly on the amount of data that we had. As far as where smooth dogfish are harvested, we could only see it by statistical area. And those statistical areas where smooth dogfish are harvested ride the line between the federal and state boundaries. So there's a lot of fishing around the 3-mile line, but at this time, we cannot attribute it to state or federal waters. So a little bit going into the data. So this chart shows landings by gear type. So as you can see, a large portion of this fishery uses sink gill nets to harvest smooth dogfish. So as shown here, as much as 75% of landings are attributed to sink gill net gear. And so we focused on sink gill net gear for this addendum. So the species caught in sink gill net gear, the pie chart shows that smooth dogfish is a dominant target species with 39% of the sink gill net catch. Often other species, along with the targeted species, are caught as well. In this case, other species include spiny dogfish at 8%, bluefish at 29%, and croaker at 8%. So this table I'm going to take a minute to explain. So each column represents the year from 2003 to 2014, and it shows, the first row shows the number of sink gill net trips within each year that landed a smooth dogfish. So it ranges from 550 trips to more recently 1,300 trips. So then the second row then further looks into, okay, of these trips that are landing smooth dogfish, how many would meet the 25% catch composition requirement? And so on average, almost half of the reported trips would meet the 25% catch composition requirement and would be considered a directed fishing trip. So then we also looked at, of the overall landings for sink gill nets, how many smooth dogfish were on those trips. And this pie chart shows that highliner trips, meaning trips where smooth dogfish comprised 75% of the overall catch on board, are responsible for the majority of smooth dogfish landings. So in fact, they're responsible for about 81% of the overall landings. So this shows that although sink gill nets can catch a range of species, fishermen can and do target smooth dogfish effectively. So that brings us to the fishery considerations. So just in summary, based on the VTR analysis of sink gill net trips, the majority of smooth dogfish landings were caught on trips that retained at least 75% smooth dogfish. Almost half of the trips that landed smooth dogfish and sink gill net gear would be considered a directed smooth dogfish trip. And the 25% catch composition is unlikely to change fishing effort to a great extent. And so this moves us into the management program options considered today. And so there's two options. Option A is status quo, and this simply means that no catch composition requirement applies. This would also mean that the state and federal FMPs would not be consistent on this issue. Whereas if you move to option B, this would establish a catch composition requirement for commercial processing for smooth dogfish at sea. And I'll read it. Fishermen in state waters and in possession of a valid state commercial fishing license can eviscerate and remove the head and all shark fins of smooth dogfish while at sea, provided smooth dogfish make up at least 25% by weight of total catch on board at the time of landing. Fishermen may retain other sharks on board, provided the fins of other sharks of shark species remain naturally attached to the carcass through offloading, as already described in the Coastal Sharks FMP. The language in this option is consistent with what is in Amendment 9. And so with that, I'll take questions.
Thank you for that presentation, Ashton. Do we have any questions for Ashton? Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ashton, you mentioned initially when you started looking at catch, whether it was federal or state waters or by state, that you kind of immediately came upon roadblocks. Do you have any is there anything that you can, any suggestions as to how we could get around those or figure out a way to look at the data to be able to tease out the state landings? I think where these fish are where they're being caught, I think is an important element to this to determine whether or not we implement similar measures in federal waters or state waters. And I'm just at the question is there something you can provide us or any ideas as to how we might be able to get around those roadblocks?
So this was a question that I came around to with the PDT several times. And so in certain states that have a trip ticket system, like North Carolina, we are able to see state landings in state versus federal waters, and I have that slide to show you. But in other states, it's just not there. When I asked, they were like, what's available in ACCSP is what we have available for this fishery. And it would take a considerable amount of work to do some of this, especially the catch composition analysis. Not even determining if it's state versus federal waters, that's hard, but also doing the catch composition analysis in addition. And the PDT thought about this and then thought about the motion that was described at the board, that the intent of this is to kind of be consistent or present an option that's consistent with the federal FMP. And should we go down this road not knowing if we're going to get the amount of data that we want?
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ashton, you use the VTR data for your analysis, and that basically is for boats with the Northeast permit. Did you have any information on vessels with like Southeast permits, for folks fishing in the South Atlantic, to get an idea of their catch composition, or even possibly where they're fishing as far as state or federal waters, based on statistical area that they're recording?
We did not look at that information specifically, but in North Carolina, we did see that about 62% of the harvest is in state waters. And we know that, as you know, North Carolina is split between the Northeast and the Southeast region. And so one of the caveats that I did put in the addendum is that this federal VTR data only considers people who have a Northeast regional permit. So it would include a good portion of North Carolina and everyone below that.
Jay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is a little off the topic of catch composition, but I became aware that the PDT had a discussion about another potential inconsistency, and this is language of offloading, which is in the federal plan, and in our plan it's harvest and landing. So what I'm trying to get a sense from you, Ashton, is was that I don't know, itemized out as something that's important and something we should potentially do for this, since we're in the process of potentially taking an action here, or is it just a kind of language nuance thing that we don't necessarily need to worry about? I'm just trying to get a sense of your opinion on that.
Okay, so this was a language in option B. Let's go back one slide. And you'll see that we say in the first line that for the catch composition requirement, It's for the total catch on board at the time of landing. And so that's fine. That's consistent with Amendment 9. And then the PDT had some talk about the term offloading. And so right now we say fishermen may retain other sharks on board provided the fins of other shark species remain naturally attached to the carcass through offloading. And the majority of the PDT felt that it was important to be consistent with Amendment 9 and use the term offloading, although that's not a term that's commonly used with the Commission. Carol can be more specific on this, but it's just the term was used because it is more specific. It requires that a vessel will not only have to land, but it'd have to offload those sharks as well. And so they felt that language was important to them, and we felt that if we want to be consistent with Amendment 9, then we should incorporate that language into this option as well.
Follow-up, Jay?
Yeah, okay, so it actually is in there in a way that is consistent with at least in the addendum that's going out for comment, it is in there in a consistent way.
Yes, it is in there, and it is consistent with Amendment 9, with the federal text as well.
Thank you.
Okay, seeing no other hands up, I would entertain a request for any changes to the addendum, or seeing none, what's the will of the board as far as moving it forward for public comment? A motion to move it forward would be required. Mr. Clark.
Move to release this addendum for public comment. Approve the addendum for public comment.
Have a second from Bill Adler. We'll get that up and then I'll read it. Move to approve Addendum 4 for public comment. Motion by Mr. Clark, second by Mr. Adler. Discussion on the motion? Seeing none, is there any objection to the motion? Seeing none, the motion passes. Is there any other business to come before us on the matter of the addendum? Ashton?
No.
Do we need to address requests for public hearings here?
Yes, if your state would like a public hearing, can you please see me after the meeting and I can start setting that up right away.
Okay, is there any other business to come before the board? Seeing no other business and having completed the agenda, the board is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you for that efficiency, Adam. The South Atlantic Board will start in 15 minutes at 10:15. Thank you. Or 10:20, sorry. My computer clock is slow.